Hi, how you going? Just a quick PowerPoint to go over the reading of Crotty, these big new ideas that have come through. So what we're doing is trying to set up a scaffold, a framework for you to start your understandings of research methodologies and methods. I think you can see already that the language is quite difficult. It has a particular language of its own, and each intellectual movement or each theoretical approach or each methodology, it has its own language as well. So what we're doing is trying to put in place a scaffold so that we can have some sort of basis for building our understanding of the different language and practices in research practice. So let me start off. So Crotty talks about four pillars. He talks about the pillar of epistemology, epistemology, theoretical framework, methodology, and then method. So what is epistemology? Well, it's partnered with the idea of ontology. There are some other ideas like this as well, such as axiology, but we're going to keep it pretty basic. Epistemology, ontology. This is the kind of the big foundational framework from which we live our lives and which we do our research. Or if we are professionals, with the way that we do our teaching, the way we do our education, whatever we're doing, policy analysis, whatever. There's a particular approach, a disposition that we have, and it's clearly invisible to us because if we haven't started to actually be reflexive on it or think about it, it's just something that sits in the back there. And probably the assumption is that all humans are pretty much the same. But whilst we are humans are similar, and more similar than we are different, we all do have different sort of epistemological and ontological bases. All right, so ontology is kind of the theory of being or reality. It's the form and nature of reality, and therefore what it is that can be known about it. It's a question about what is a human. So when we talk about recapturing ontology, we're trying to get back to understanding how people live and be in certain environments. It's a way of trying to understand the human condition and human capacities. So ontology, in a humanist sense, gives us a really clear idea of what it means to be human and how we can enhance that. Sitting alongside of that is epistemology, which is about the theory of knowledge. It's also about what is the relationship between the knower, the researcher, and what can be known, the researched. All right. So epistemology basically is a way of trying to understand how I know what I know and what is the kind of the criteria for knowing something. So epistemology and ontology are very two sides of the same sort of thing, really. And as I said, there are some other ideas there as well. What I want you to do is sort of question yourself: what is my ontology? What do I think it means to be a human? Do you think a human is just something that's biological and physiological? It's just been born and just automatically does things by instinct? Or do you think that maybe we're born into the world and then the way that we interact with that world, develops us, shapes us, constructs us? Right. So there's two really. Just in that little example, you've got this idea there of objectivism as a particular kind of epistemology. What you see is what you get. And the other idea I gave you was a constructionist idea that humans are constructed over time and through interaction with their social and cultural environments. There are other approaches too, and so you've got to read and read and read this, try and get a sense of what the different ontological and epistemological ideas are. Now, one interesting thing here is that theoretically, over the years, sometimes one of these words gets, or one of these concepts gets emphasized over the other. So, for example, the move into social constructionism over the last 20 years has created what is sometimes called the epistemological fallacy. And that is the conflation of epistemology and ontology. The idea that your experience represents the way the world is. Well, it doesn't. That's a kind of a form of empiricism. So we want to keep the two separate, and we want to try and move away from, I argue, an idea that, for example, that we are merely an effect of knowledge. We are merely an effect of language. All right. So what we're looking at here then is doing some work on ontology and epistemology so that we have a clear sort of foundation about what we expect about the world and what sort of knowledge we want to produce. Right, well, the second big idea in Crotty's 4 pillars is theory. Now, this is a challenging one because there are as many theories as there are different people in the world. Well, not really, but there's a great lot of diversity in theory and theoretical frameworks. What does theory do? Theory is kind of the lens, it's the way that it articulates us with the research area. It's usually we pick theories that come from our epistemological and ontological background. So, for example, if I was wearing a white coat and doing experimental design, then my epistemology would be objectivist, and the kind of theory I would use would be positivism. So you can see this in Crotty's book and also in Blakey and a few others, and I've sent out a reading just today by Denson, which outlines, it's a table and outlines a lot of the different positions. Some theories that I know of that we might encounter are phenomenology, hermeneutics, symbolic interactionism. I guess you could roughly say postmodernism as a kind of theory. Critical realism is a kind of theory. It's a bit bigger than that, but it is also theoretical, has a particular theory about the world. We can get into psychology theories, so attribution theory, motivation theory, self-efficacy, these sorts of ideas. The sorts of theories you get in sociology tend to want to bring together structure and agency. Or, that's not entirely true because sometimes they emphasize one over the other. Whereas psychology doesn't really have a sense of structure or a very strong sense of culture. So it's really about about understanding the individual. And those theories are about, individual sort of practices or capacities. So it's a very, very important level in this scaffold is theoretical framework. You will not be able to do your proposal unless you have some sort of theoretical framework. So as we go through the course, we need to be asking the questions, what kind of question am I asking? What is the subject area? And what kind of theoretical approach could I use to really sort of illuminate this? Okay, your next point on the 4 pillars is methodology. And methodology, you might sort of align it with the idea of pedagogy. And I'm just really using this as an example because most of us here are educators. What I'm trying to say is that it's a philosophy. Methodology is kind of the philosophy of your research design. Within the methodology, there are particular kinds of methods. So the methods are the practical things that we do to get the research done. Interviewing, these sorts of things. Methodology is the sort of the philosophy and the logic and a particular rationality behind the way that we construct the research. Methodologies can be things like participatory action research, discourse analysis, ethnographies, case studies. These are all forms of methodology. So you can see that we've got 3 levels we've just talked about. We've talked about epistemology and ontology. This is the broad foundation, your disposition to the world and to knowledge. We've got theory, which is the different framework that sort of complements that epistemological position, that ontological position, and gives us a framework for, looking at some things and not others. So it's a way of being precise and also filtering. Then we have methodology, which outlines the kind of the broad philosophy and research design that we're going to approach. And then we take on the different methods: interviewing, surveys, focus groups, documents and archives, photograph analysis, observation. These are sort of typical types of methods. Well, at the theoretical level, there are 3, at least there's more, but here are 3 kind of approaches. 3 different theoretical approaches. There are more, but here are the 3 key ones, 3 big ones. I would give a bunch more because I tend to fall outside of these. These are pretty much the orthodoxy, if you like. So there's positivism. That's your white coat, your scientific approach. This is the belief that objective accounts of the world can be given. There is a truth, and the function of science is to develop explanations in the form of universal laws. Okay, it tends to argue that the senses are unmediated by culture. That the concept does correspond to the object. That is what you think you're describing, you are describing. All right. So other approaches would say that's not the case at all. So positivism, post-positivism is a kind of typical sort of psychological science approach. Then there's interpretivism, which tends to be the more sort of liberal qualitative approach. It tends to include phenomenology, hermeneutics, symbolic interactionism, and it falls under the epistemology of constructionism. Okay, so what we've got here in this slide are two theories and one epistemology. All right, constructionism is an epistemology that argues that realities are local, specific, and constructed. They are socially and experientially based and depend on the individuals or groups holding them. Okay, so what we're saying is that we may come into the world sort of biological and physiological, but we can't really know that. We can sort of kind of know it to some extent, but actually what happens through life is that we meet different people, we engage in different interactions, we go to different locations, we do different things, we become part of different institutions, and the way that we think about the world changes and develops. Okay, now using this approach, there are kind of two key approaches to making sense of to starting our research. And one is a paradigm-driven approach, and that is like you take your theoretical approach quite seriously, develop research questions in that context, and forefront the paradigm as the way of trying to understand it. Okay, a question-driven approach is different. So we begin with a kind of a question about something, we develop it into a research question, and we choose the methods for answering them. Now, to finish off, there is a kind of a key point here, and one is that you can't expect you to know every element of qualitative or quantitative research. I don't know it all. You can't get it all together in one. So much reading and research to be able to do that. So we have to kind of find a way of understanding them, but then choosing the one that suits us best. So we're not trying to develop you as methodologists, but we don't want you to just only be really good in one approach either. We want you to have some understanding. So that's why we've got the 4 pillars and the scaffold, that kind of scaffolding approach. So really the way to get good at that is to read. And I would start off by reading some of those textbooks like Crotty or Blakey and some others. Clive Seal, I think, does a good one called Culture and Research. Anyway, we can talk about that. I'll give you more readings. But the Denzen article, for example, gives you a table of all the different approaches. So we just really need to get familiar with the language, familiar with the ideas, and then develop pretty quickly some idea of how we can apply them.